Whatever happens, do not tell her the car is dead. Then somebody better learn to raise the dead. We have little time left. What did you just say about my father's car? Miss Ashford, ma'am, we've tried everything. The Stratton won't start. $30 million and it won't make a sound. Perhaps we auction it as a static piece. Excuse me, I can fix your problem. I'm sorry. Who are you? Rowan Hayes. Ma'am, I fix things around your estate. The handyman. The handyman wants to touch a $30 million car. See? Send this man back to his mop. No, wait. This is adorable. Work boots. You think you can fix what the factory specialist couldn't? Yes, ma'am, I do. Fine. Fix it and I'll marry you. Have you ever been laughed at by people who decided your worth before you ever opened your mouth? This night was already a trap. The Ashford estate claimed a stretch of Newport coastline. Acres of lawn rolled down to the Atlantic like poured green silk. And at the top of that lawn stood a limestone mansion with dozens of rooms and a ballroom built for kings. Every June, its iron gates open for a single night, the Ashford Legacy Gala. Hundreds of guests, a charity auction, and enough old money gathered under one roof to buy a small nation. People spent years angling for an invitation. Senators came, movie stars came, tech founders flew in from the coast, and this year, every one of them had come for a reason that had nothing to do with charity. They had come to hear a dead man's engine sing one last time. Alden Ashford had built his fortune in shipping, but he had spent his heart on machines. His collection of vintage automobiles was famous on 3 continents, and one car stood above everything else he owned. A Stratton GT, a factory prototype, one of one. So rare that historians argued over whether it should ever be driven again, or simply sealed behind glass like a saint's relic. Alden had died some time ago. Tonight, his daughter was letting the crown jewel go. The plan was pure theater. The Stratton would rise on a lit turntable in the center of the ballroom. Its 12-cylinder engine would be started one final time in front of the cameras before the auction hammer fell. A farewell song, a goodbye, performed for the whole world. The estimate stood at $30 million, and the auction house had whispered that the right bidding war could push it far beyond that. Nobody planning that goodbye knew the man who actually kept the estate alive. Rowan Hayes had worked there for some years. He fixed the irrigation pumps in spring and nursed the ancient boiler through every winter. He rewired the boathouse after the flood. He kept decades-old garden machinery running on parts he machined himself alone on a small lathe in the tool shed. He did all of it quietly in worn boots and a gray uniform. And he had learned what every quiet man in a gray uniform learns. You become furniture. Guests handed him empty glasses without looking at him. The kitchen staff called him when something broke and forgot his name the moment it was fixed. Christmases had come and gone without a single card bearing his name. Evelyn Ashford had spoken to him only a handful of times. Each time her eyes had settled somewhere just past his shoulder, the way people look at lampposts. She was not cruel by design. She was something far more common. She had simply never needed to see him. In her world, talent wore tailored suits and arrived trailing letters of recommendation. Talent got profiled in magazines. Talent did not carry a toolbox, and it certainly did not unclog the fountain drains. On the night of the gala, the estate glowed like a lit stage. Strings of light traced the hedges. A jazz quartet played on the terrace, while waiters slid through the crowd with champagne and lobster, and the air carried salt off the ocean, cut roses, and the faint sweetness of money. In the center of the ballroom, under a silver silk cover, the Stratton GT waited on its turntable like an altar before a ceremony. Merrick Whitlock ran the evening with a clipboard, a headset, and a smile that never reached his eyes. The estate manager was silver-haired and smooth as lake ice, the kind of man who flattered guests and snapped at staff in the same breath. He had spent months coordinating the sale with the auction house handling the Ashford collection. Every minute of the night sat printed on his schedule, and he had found Rowan that afternoon to deliver one instruction twice slowly, as if to a child. Stay away from the ballroom, check the dock lights, watch the generator, remain out of sight. Tonight is for decorative people, he said, and you are not decorative. Rowan obeyed. He was on a ladder behind the terrace, adjusting a floodlight when the schedule began to die. Factory specialists from the Stratton Heritage Division lifted the silk cover for a final systems check. The ritual start was supposed to be a formality. The car had been fully serviced recently. Fresh fluids, inspected lines, a certified report signed, stamped, and filed with the insurance company. The lead specialist settled into the seat, breathed like a priest before Mass, and turned the key. The engine cranked, caught for half a second, and died. He tried again. Crank, cough, silence. The second specialist frowned and checked the obvious suspects. Battery strong, spark present, fuel gauge full. They pulled a plug and found it bone dry, which made no sense at all because the tank was full and every line had been certified. For some time, two of the best-trained men in the vintage car world took turns failing in front of each other, while the most expensive automobile either of them had ever touched sat silent as a tomb. Panic in a place like that does not shout. It whispers. It moves through service corridors like smoke under a door. A waiter heard it from a porter. A bartender heard it from the waiter. By the time it reached Evelyn, she was in the middle of a laugh with a senator's wife, and the laugh died on her face. She excused herself, walked backstage, and heard her own staff whispering the sentence that no host of such an evening should ever hear. Whatever happens, do not tell her the car is dead. She heard it anyway, and her panic was not really about the money. The start was the heart of the entire night. She had promised the world one last song from her father's engine. Hundreds of witnesses stood out there with raised phones and practiced smiles, half of them praying for a triumph, the other half quietly hungry for a disaster. If the Strattons stayed silent, the morning headline would not mention charity. It would say that Alden Ashford's daughter could not keep his legacy running. In her world, that sentence was a kind of death. Merrick appeared at her elbow with a solution already polished. "Cancel the start," he murmured. "Announce a static auction. Blame the ocean humidity. Control the story. Keep the evening moving. Collectors buy history, not noise. A car like this does not need to run in order to sell." It was reasonable. It was calm. It came just a little too quickly, like a man reading from a script he had rehearsed in the mirror. Evelyn was too frightened to notice. The crowd was too rich to care. The only person who would ever notice was carrying a ladder past the service entrance some distance away. Rowan heard the sound through the open door. Crank, cough, silence. He stopped walking. He stood very still in the dark with the ladder on his shoulder, and he listened the way other men remember. He had heard that exact rhythm before. Years ago. Another garage. Another life on a machine whose silence had cost him everything he loved. That sound did not say bad battery. It did not say flooded engine or fouled plugs. That sound said fuel starvation, hungry cylinders, a healthy heart being strangled by an empty artery. And the certified service report said that was impossible. Between those two facts lived a question. Rowan Hayes had spent his entire life unable to walk past a question shaped like an engine. He set the ladder down against the wall. He wiped his hands on a rag out of habit the way his grandfather had taught him. Then he walked through the service door across the marble into the blaze of the chandeliers. A man in a gray uniform crossing a room full of black ties and diamonds. Heads turned. Conversations stumbled. A waiter tried to wave him back. He kept walking until he stood at the edge of the turntable, looked at the most powerful woman in Newport, and said the 6 words that made hundreds of millionaires laugh at once. You already heard what she answered. You heard the laughter roll across the marble, and Merrick's voice slicing above it, telling her to send the man back to his mop. You heard the joke that was meant to bury him. Fix it, and I'll marry you. You heard the champagne glasses chime and salute, and somebody calling for the band to play a wedding march. What the crowd saw was a handyman embarrassing himself in front of the richest room in America. What the crowd could not see was that 2 mysteries had just collided under one chandelier. Whether a man like Rowan Hayes would ever be allowed to be more than invisible, and why a perfect certified $30 million car had chosen this exact night to die at the exact moment its silence would cost the most. One of those mysteries had been years in the making. The other had taken some days. Both of them were about to crack open in front of the world. Remember the sound of that laughter. Hold on to it because in a few minutes you are going to hear exactly what it sounds like when it stops. To understand why a man in a gray uniform walked into that ballroom, you have to leave Newport. You have to travel back to a cramped repair shop on the east side of Detroit, where the air tasted like motor oil and burnt coffee, and the radio only played gospel on Sundays. The shop belonged to Silas Hayes. He was a tall, slow-moving man, with hands like cracked leather, and he had fixed cars in that same building for decades. Doctors brought him their sedans. Preachers brought him their buses. Men who could not pay brought him whatever they drove. And Silas fixed those too, because he believed a machine left broken was a small sin against the world. His grandson Rowan grew up under those cars. The boy learned to listen to engines before he learned to read. Silas would stand him on a milk crate, close the boy's eyes with one oily palm, and make him name the problem by sound alone. A ticking lifter, a slipping belt, a carburetor running lean. Get it wrong and you try it again. Get it right and the old man would laugh from somewhere deep in his chest and slip him a peppermint. One winter afternoon, a customer looked at little Rowan's hands and asked Silas if the boy was going to amount to anything. Silas did not get angry. He wiped a dipstick clean, held it up to the light, and said the sentence that would carry his grandson through everything that came after. An engine doesn't know the color of the hands that fix it. He said it the way other men quote scripture. The metal does not care where you went to school, he told Rowan. It does not care what your father did or what the neighbors think. It only cares whether you understand it. Be the man who understands it, and let the rest of the world catch up whenever it can. Rowan built his life on that sentence. He earned a scholarship, then an engineering degree, then a seat at a privateer endurance team that ran against factory giants twice its size. He was designing fuel delivery systems for engines that screamed through the night. The work was brutal and beautiful. For some years, his systems never failed, not once. Then came the race that ended everything. The prototype starved, stumbled, and grenaded its engine on live television. Millions in sponsorship burned with it. An inquiry followed, and the team's veteran crew chief swore he had built the fuel system exactly to Rowan's numbers. The numbers on file told a different story than the ones Rowan had written. He said so. He said it clearly, calmly, with his folder of original calculations in his hand. Nobody opened the folder. The inquiry believed decades of friendships over years of brilliance, and it believed a familiar face over a young black engineer who had been hired, some whispered, to make the team photo look modern. He was not fired. It was softer than that. Projects dried up. Calls went unanswered. Within time, he was gone. And the word was that Rowan Hayes was talented, but careless. And you cannot have careless. His grandfather died the following spring. Rowan drove the old tow truck back from the funeral, parked it, and stopped calling himself an engineer. The job in Newport found him almost by accident. Good pay, quiet work, a cottage by the service gate. He told himself it was peace. But nights in a rented garage outside town, he pulled the tarp off a rusted coupe that had been his grandfather's last unfinished project. And he worked until late, bringing it back to life. He machined what he could not buy. He rebuilt what no catalog stocked. The hands stayed sharp because the hands refused to forget, and the ears stayed sharper. That was the thing about the gift Silas had hammered into him on that milk crate. It did not switch off. Every machine on the estate spoke to him whether he wanted it or not. And on this June night, some distance from a chandelier and a laughing crowd, a $30 million engine had whispered something familiar. Crank, cough, silence. The exact rhythm of the failure that had destroyed his name. The failure an inquiry once called his carelessness. The failure he had replayed countless times and never once been allowed to disprove. Walking away would have been easy. He had been walking away for years. But somewhere between the service door and the turntable, a milk crate, a peppermint, and a dead man's voice made the decision for him. An engine doesn't know the color of the hands that fix it. It was time the world found out too. The laughter took a long time to die. When it finally did, Evelyn Ashford was still smiling, but something behind the smile had started to calculate. The specialists had failed. The clock was bleeding. And the man in the gray uniform had not laughed, had not blushed, had not retreated a single step. He simply stood there, calm as a Sunday morning, waiting for an answer to a question. Nobody believed he had the right to ask. So she made it official, because that is what people do when they think they cannot lose. She raised her voice so the whole ballroom could share the joke. The handyman would have some time, she announced. Some time with her father's $30 million masterpiece in front of everyone under the lights. If the engine sang, she would honor her word, and the room howled again at the thought of the wedding. If it stayed silent, he would hand in his uniform and find a new town to be invisible in. She even had the auction house turn its live stream camera toward the turntable. Strangers were watching online by the time the cover came fully off the car. The crowd sighed when the silk slid away. Low, silver, impossibly long, the Stratton GT looked less like a car and more like a held breath. Even silent, it commanded the room the way its first owner once had. Somewhere behind the rope, a collector whispered that the hood alone was worth a house. That was when Merrick Whitlock stopped smiling. He moved fast. He spoke about insurance riders and liability clauses. He reminded her that the policy covered certified technicians only, and that one wrong touch could erase millions in value. He called the whole idea charming and impossible in the same sentence. Then, when she hesitated, he leaned close and lowered his voice. "Think of your father's memory," he said. "Do not let a janitor turn his funeral into a circus." His knuckles had gone white around the clipboard. It was the wrong sentence. Evelyn had spent time drowning in advice about her father's memory. Something about hearing it from a man with a clipboard on this night, with the cameras already rolling, lit a small rebellious fire in her. She straightened, looked past Merrick, and asked the room a question. Was there anyone present qualified to supervise, just to keep the insurance men happy? For a moment, nothing. Then the crowd shifted near the terrace doors, and an old man in a charcoal dinner jacket stepped forward with a glass of seltzer in his hand. Half the collectors in the room recognized him before he said a word. Victor Cole, decades of restoration royalty, the man whose workshop had brought back the great pre-war legends whose signature in a logbook could double a car's value at any auction on Earth. He had pulled drowned engines out of lake beds and made them sing again. Kings had waited years for a slot in his workshop calendar. The auction house had flown him in as a guest of honor, a living certificate of authenticity for the evening. He set down his glass, studied Rowan the way a jeweler studies a stone, and said he would be glad to stand witness. His exact words traveled through the room like a stock tip. "I want to see what the quiet man hears." Merrick's objections died in his throat. "You do not lecture Victor Cole about engine bays." What happened next? Nobody expected. Rowan spoke not to defend himself, to set terms. He asked that no one else touch the car from this moment forward. Not the specialists, not the staff, not Mr. Whitlock, only him. He asked for a work light, a fender cover, and his own toolbox from the shed. Nothing borrowed. And he asked for one more thing. He would narrate every step out loud in plain English so that every guest and every camera understood exactly what he was doing. "So you'll know exactly what was done to this car," he said. "And by whom?" A strange sentence. The crowd took it as showmanship. One man in that ballroom took it differently. Those who watched the video later, frame by frame, saw Merrick Whitlock's jaw tighten at those last two words, and saw him glance just once toward the service file room. Evelyn agreed to everything with a wave of her hand, the way you indulge a street magician before the trick goes wrong. The ballroom rearranged itself into a theater. Guests pressed forward in a wide circle, diamonds and dinner jackets 3 rows deep. Waiters stopped serving, the jazz quartet gave up entirely, phones rose like a field of glowing periscopes, and at the back, discreetly, a silver-haired hedge fund manager started taking bets. The odds against Rowan ran high. Laughter rippled again, lighter now, nervous at the edges. Somebody whispered that this was better entertainment than the auction itself. Somebody else called it the Handyman show, and the name stuck, traveling the room in delighted murmurs. Rowan heard all of it, the jokes, the odds, the wedding march. Someone hummed as he rolled up his sleeves. He had heard versions of that soundtrack his entire life, in classrooms, in interviews, where men decided his guilt without opening a folder. The sound no longer moved him. He spread the fender cover over the Stratton's flank, with the gentleness of a father pulling a blanket over a sleeping child, and the mockery faded to the edge of his attention like weather. Victor positioned himself nearby, arms folded, eyes narrowed to slits. Evelyn checked the time on a borrowed phone and declared it aloud. And here is what the crowd missed while it was busy being entertained. They thought they were watching a man gamble his job on a miracle. They were actually watching a specialist return to an operating room after years of exile with a patient he already understood better than anyone alive. Because Rowan was not guessing. He had heard the engine's complaint through a service door, and his ears had already narrowed 1,000 possibilities down to 3. The crowd saw a mop. Victor saw a method. Merrick, pale and silent by the file room door, saw a countdown. 3 suspects. Hundreds of people watching a man the hostess had refused to look at for years. The chandelier light pulled on the Stratton's long silver hood. Somewhere outside, the ocean kept time against the rocks. Rowan Hayes clicked open the latches of his battered toolbox, the same box that had once sat in a Detroit repair shop between a milk crate and a radio playing gospel, and he went to work. Rowan did not open the hood. That was the first surprise. Instead, he walked to the driver's door, leaned in, and asked the lead specialist for a few seconds of cranking. The specialist looked at Evelyn. Evelyn shrugged. The key turned, and the dead car coughed its sad rhythm into the silence one more time. Crank. Cough. Nothing. And Rowan held up his hand and closed his eyes in front of hundreds of people. The crowd tittered. He looked like a man pretending to read minds at a birthday party. Then he started talking, calm and clear, the way he had promised. The battery is healthy. You can hear it in the cranking speed, strong and even. The spark is alive, too. That little half-catch means the cylinders are firing on fumes. This engine is not sick. This engine is starving. Fuel is reaching the carburetors, but it is not reaching them with pressure. Somewhere between the tank and the engine, the push is gone. He opened his eyes and looked at the two specialists. You found dry plugs in a full tank, and it made no sense to you. It makes sense if the pump has quit, not the electrics, the mechanical pump. Silence of a new kind crossed the ballroom. Confusion takes one shape in a crowd. Attention takes another. The specialists exchanged a glance, and the glance said everything. They had been circling that same suspicion without committing to it. Victor Cole stepped closer to the engine bay, and the old man's voice carried easily because rooms go quiet for men like him. Sound diagnosis. Cranking tone confirms compression and battery. The half-catch confirms spark. He has eliminated half the engine without lifting a panel. I could not have done it faster. He paused, and a small dry smile bent his mouth for the first time that evening. And I have been doing this since before most of you were born. Nobody was humming the wedding march anymore. At the back of the room, the hedge fund manager quietly stopped taking bets. The odds had begun to feel like an insult to somebody, and nobody was sure who anymore. Now Rowan opened the hood, and the room leaned in with him. He worked the latches gently, propped the long silver panel, and laid out his tools on the fender cover in a neat surgical row. He kept narrating as his hands moved. The Stratton's pump was mechanical, he explained, driven by the engine itself, a design from an age before electronics. Inside it lived a rubber diaphragm, a flexible disc no bigger than a coffee cup lid, flexing thousands of times a minute, pulling fuel forward with every beat. It is the heart of the car, he said, and I think this heart has a torn valve. It took him some minutes to free the pump. He held it up to the work light, cracked the housing open with a small brass driver, and went very still. Victor saw at the same second the crowd saw only two men staring at a small dark disc. The diaphragm is ruptured, Rowan said at last. Split at the edge, that is the failure. But that is not the problem. He turned the disc slowly in the light. This is the wrong part. This is cheap aftermarket rubber, the kind that swells and tears when it meets the ethanol in modern fuel. It does not belong in this car. The original specification is a layered synthetic, and the service file for this vehicle says exactly that. He looked up. The file says a new old stock diaphragm factory sealed was installed during the service recently. Whatever this is, it is not that. The sentence moved through the ballroom in a slow wave. Guests who understood cars explained it in whispers to guests who did not. The technical mystery had cracked open, and inside it something uglier was visible. A certified report that described one part, a dying car that contained another. Somewhere between the paper and the engine bay stood a human being who had made that happen. Evelyn's smile was gone now. She had stopped performing for her guests entirely. Could it be a mistake? She asked, and her voice had lost its champagne sparkle. A supplier error? A mix-up in a box? That is possible, ma'am, Rowan said evenly. Boxes get mislabeled. Suppliers make mistakes. He set the ruptured disc down on a white cloth where the cameras could find it. So, let us look at the rest of the pump. A supplier error happens once. He bent over the open housing again, and soon stopped moving for the second time. When he straightened, he was holding something between two fingers, small and bright as a bullet casing, a one-way valve. He turned toward Victor, and for the first time all night, Rowan Hayes asked for a witness. Mr. Cole, would you tell the room which direction this valve was installed? Victor took the little brass piece, examined it, and his face changed in a way that made the front row go cold. He was not smiling anymore either. Backwards, he said. The check valve was seated against the flow. The pump was fighting itself with every stroke. It tore that diaphragm apart from the inside. He handed it back as if it were dirty. A first-year apprentice could not make this mistake. The valve only seats one way with the gasket aligned. Someone took it apart and chose to put it back like this. One error is an accident, Rowan said quietly. The whole room heard it anyway. Two errors in the same pump, pulling in the same direction before the biggest start of this car's life. That is not an accident. That is arithmetic. He did not say a name. He did not look at anyone. He picked up the dead diaphragm, read the supplier marking stamped along its rim, and recited the lot number out loud slowly, twice, so every phone in the room caught it cleanly. Then he asked one mild question into the silence. Who signed the service file? Paper rustles louder than thunder when a room is quiet enough. The records clerk, a serious young woman who had been clutching the vehicle dossier all evening like a hymnal, opened the folder before anyone thought to stop her. The service had been carried out by an outside contractor, approved, inspected, and signed in the final box by the estate manager, Merrick Whitlock. Every head in the ballroom turned at once. A single motion, like a field bending under wind. Merrick did the worst thing a man can do under hundreds of pairs of eyes. He smiled. The smile sat wrong on his face, and his voice came out 2 notes too high. The contractor was a licensed firm, he said. He had signed paperwork, not torn rubber. He signed documents. He would not know a diaphragm from a dinner plate, and he resented, deeply resented, what was being implied by a man who cleaned gutters for a living. Nothing was implied, Rowan said without turning around. I read a number off a part. You stood up. Somewhere in the crowd, a single laugh escaped. It was not aimed at the handyman this time. Evelyn stood frozen between them, and you could watch the evening rearranging itself behind her eyes. The schedule, the insurance calls, the humidity excuse, the polished little speech about static auctions, all of it lining up into a shape she did not want to see. She was not a stupid woman. She had simply spent her whole life trusting the people who dressed the part. She looked at Merrick for a long, terrible moment. Then she looked at Rowan, truly looked at him, first time, and asked what he needed. Some minutes, he said, and nobody near this car. What followed silenced even the whispers. Rowan took the ruined pump apart completely, cleaned every passage with solvent from his own kit, and seated the brass valve the way its makers intended. Then, with the cameras pushing in close, he did the thing nobody watching would ever forget. He could not use a part that did not exist in any drawer, so he made one. From the bottom tray of his toolbox came a sheet of layered synthetic rubber, kept for rebuilding the estate's old fuel equipment. He traced the dead diaphragm's outline with a scribe, cut the disc with a hooked blade, and punched the center hole with a hollow brass tube and 2 taps of a hammer. The taps rang across the marble like a tiny bell. His hands did not hurry and did not hesitate. They moved the way handwriting moves when a man signs his own name. Victor watched the fabrication without blinking, leaning closer and closer, until the old man was practically inside the work light. The crowd watched Victor. That is how rooms learn what they are seeing. The legend's face was doing something none of them had seen. It looked like respect. It looked almost like grief. The particular grief of a master discovering that a treasure had been left out in the rain for years. Rowan seated the new disc, torqued the housing in a slow star pattern, and remounted the pump. He primed the lines by hand until fuel kissed the carburetor inlets, then wiped each fitting dry and checked them twice for weeping. He closed his toolbox. He folded the fender cover. He looked at the clock on the far wall, and hundreds of people looked with him. One turn of a key between a handyman and a promise made in front of the world. The technical loop stood 1 heartbeat from closing. The moral one had barely begun to open, because a room full of powerful people was about to learn what it had been laughing at. The ballroom had forgotten how to breathe. Hundreds of people stood in a silence so complete you could hear the candles burning. The air near the turntable smelled of gasoline and old leather, of solvent and cut roses. A strange perfume that belonged to no other night in history. Chandelier light pulled on the Stratton's long silver hood and broke into pieces wherever the metal curved. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the Atlantic kept rolling against the rocks, patient as a heartbeat. Rowan settled into the driver's seat the way you sit in a church pew. The old leather creaked under him. His palm found the shifter confirmed neutral and came to rest on the key. For 1 second he was not in Newport at all. He was a boy, standing on a milk crate with an oily hand over his eyes, listening for the truth. He turned the key. The starter spun. The engine caught, surged, and stumbled. A ragged cough that rocked the whole car on its springs. Then silence again, enormous and total. Someone in the crowd let out a tiny, involuntary sound like a string snapping. Merrick's chin lifted. In the front row, the Countess who had bet against Rowan reached for her necklace. Evelyn pressed both hands together against her lips, and the live stream chat went white with scrolling disbelief. Rowan did not flinch. He listened. The stumble had not been a no. It had been an almost, the sound of fuel arriving rich and uneven into cold throats. The carburetors had been sitting dry, their settings nudged by a stranger's screwdriver. He climbed out, walked to the engine bay, and held his ear close above the velocity stacks like a doctor leaning over a patient's chest. Then his fingers found the idle mixture screws, and the ballroom watched a man tune a $30 million engine by memory. A quarter turn here, an eighth there. He was not reading gauges. There were no gauges to read. He was matching the engine in front of him to a sound he carried in his head. The clean, round idle of a Stratton 12, a note he had memorized from his grandfather's worn records, the way other children memorized hymns. The room saw fingertips and brass. Victor, nearby, saw perfect pitch. Rowan wiped his hands, returned to the seat, and gripped the key a second time. He closed his eyes. "Sing," he whispered. Not for them, for the old man. He turned it. The starter spun once, twice, and the engine detonated into life, with a sound that hit the crowd like a wave breaking. 12 cylinders, one voice. The roar climbed the marble walls, rattled the champagne flutes on abandoned trays, and set the chandelier crystals shivering in their settings. It was not noise. It was a chord, deep and furious, and impossibly alive. The sound of refusing to die. The floor itself trembled. People felt it in their teeth, in their ribs, in the glasses they had forgotten they were holding. For full seconds, nobody moved. The engine settled into a rich, rolling idle, steady as a sleeping lion, and the sound wrapped around the room like something sacred. Then the ballroom detonated too. The applause came in a single crash. No polite beginning. Guests who had bet against him cheered the loudest, the way crowds always do when they need somewhere to hide their shame. The Countess was crying and did not seem to know it. The specialists from the Heritage Division applauded with their hands above their heads, surrendering completely. Strangers flooded the live stream with a single repeated word. Handyman, handyman, handyman. Victor Cole walked to the driver's door, took Rowan's wrist, and raised his arm into the chandelier light like a referee crowning a fighter. The old man's voice cracked as he shouted over the engine. "Remember this night? You just watched a master come home." And Evelyn Ashford stood alone in the center of her father's ballroom, hands still pressed to her mouth, listening to the song she had been promised. She had her miracle. The auction was saved. The legacy would sell. Every camera in the room expected her to celebrate, and she could not, because one thought kept closing around her like cold water. She had owned this miracle for years. She had handed him empty glasses without looking at his face, and some time ago, in front of the whole world, she had thrown a wedding at him, as a punchline. The engine sang on, and somewhere under that sound, a question waited with its teeth showing. If it were you standing in that ballroom, would you have stepped forward or stayed invisible? Tell me in the comments, and if this story already has your heart beating, share it with someone who has been underestimated, and subscribe because what happened next is the part nobody saw coming. The music was back. The reckoning had not even started. Later, the hammer fell at a higher sum. The bidding war had been savage, and everyone in the room knew why. The Stratton was no longer just a car. It was the car from the video. The machine that had been sabotaged, mourned, and resurrected on a turntable in front of the world. The winning bidder, a soft-spoken software magnate from Austin, raised his paddle one final time, and then did something no one had ever seen. He made his purchase conditional. He would sign nothing until the gentleman in the gray uniform personally signed the technical dossier. He wanted the history of this night in the file with the right name on it. So Rowan Hayes signed the documents of the automobile while the room applauded. Victor Cole was waiting when he set down the pen. The old man did not do small talk. He offered Rowan the position of head of restoration at his works on the spot in front of witnesses at triple whatever the estate was paying. Then he lowered his voice, though not so low the nearest cameras missed it. He said he had followed the inquiry years ago. He said the numbers in that file had never added up, and that men in his world had whispered about it for years, while braver men said nothing. I watched them bury an engineer, he said. Tonight I watched him dig his way out. Rowan did not trust his own voice. He just shook the offered hand hard. And then the crowd parted because Evelyn Ashford was walking toward the turntable. She had taken off her heels somewhere. She crossed the marble barefoot, small for the first time in her own ballroom, and she stopped in front of the man she had laughed at earlier. The whole room held its champagne and waited for her to speak. Mr. Hayes, she said, 2 words, his name and a door opening. What she said next and what he answered would be replayed countless times. She offered him the wedding, not seriously, and not as a joke either, but as something in between, a rich woman's way of asking how to repay an impossible debt. She stood barefoot on the marble, and said she supposed she owed him a ring, and the room laughed one more time nervously, unsure who was allowed to laugh at what anymore. Rowan closed his toolbox before he answered. The click of the latches carried like a gavel. You don't owe me a wedding, ma'am, he said. You owe yourself a better way of seeing people. No applause followed. Something quieter happened instead. Hundreds of people looked at their shoes, and one barefoot woman nodded slowly, like a student receiving a grade she knew she had earned. Within a day, that sentence was a caption. Within a week, it was printed on shirts the family never authorized and never fought. The rest of the justice arrived on schedule, the way arithmetic always does. The auction house froze the service file. The investigators worked backward through the contractor's invoices and found what saboteurs always leave behind: a money trail dressed up as paperwork. Merrick Whitlock had quietly steered the Stratton's service to an unlicensed shop owned by a friend, pocketing the difference. Then he had gone one step darker. Phone records showed a private collector, a man who had wanted the Stratton for years, had offered Merrick a commission if the car came to market, broken, unstartable, and cheap. The static auction speech had been written before the engine ever failed. He was escorted off the estate, clipboard left behind on a banquet table. The auction house filed for fraud. The insurance company filed for the rest. By the end of the month, every estate and auction firm on the East Coast had quietly closed its doors to him, and the man who once decided who was decorative was explaining himself to investigators in a borrowed suit. The video did its own work. Millions of views, cut and recut, captioned in a dozen languages. The first half showed a ballroom laughing at a handyman. The second half showed the handyman's hands, the brass valve, the resurrection. Nobody needed a narrator to explain the lesson, and the internet, for once, aimed its anger at the right target, while the comments filled with people telling their own stories of being invisible. Evelyn Ashford did not hide. She stood in front of the cameras some days later, no stylist, no script, and called her own behavior by its name. Then she did the only thing money can honestly do about a thing like that. She funded a trade scholarship for kids who learn with their hands, fully endowed, named not after her family, but after a Detroit mechanic she had never met. The Silas Hayes Scholarship. Rowan read the announcement twice before he believed the name, and one more file came back from the dead. Victor Cole sent the inquiry to 2 motorsport journalists with long memories and longer teeth. They found the altered specifications inside some weeks, exactly where Rowan's unopened folder had always said they would be. The crew chief, who had sworn on his decades, confessed through a lawyer. The sanctioning body issued a formal correction late. The failure was not attributable to engineer Rowan Hayes. His grandfather never lived to read it. Rowan framed it anyway, and hung it in the shop beside a photograph of a man holding a dipstick up to the light. Some debts get paid late, but the engine keeps the ledger. 1 year later, kids in brand new coveralls stood around an open engine bay at the works, the first Silas Hayes scholarship class. Rowan closed their eyes with one oily palm one by one, and asked each of them to name the problem by sound alone. Every color of hand in that room got the same peppermint for a right answer. Outside the roller doors sat a coupe finished at last, bronze paint shining like a kept promise. An engine doesn't know the color of the hands that fix it. It never did. If this story moved you, share it with someone the world refuses to see. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and watch the ballroom scene again. because sharp-eyed viewers will catch Merrick checking his watch seconds before the engine ever failed. And tell me in the comments, who is the Rowan Hayes in your life? I told this story because I grew up watching people like Rowan get talked over. Some of the smartest hands I have ever known never got a title. If tonight one of them feels seen, that is worth more to me than every view this video will ever receive.